Imagine waking up one morning to discover that an animal declared extinct for thousands of years is alive again, not in a museum, not in a fossil, but standing in front of you. Scientists are already studying ways to reverse extinction using ancient DNA, gene editing, cloning technologies, and closely related living species. But here's the catch. Bringing an extinct animal back isn't simply a matter of finding its DNA and pressing copy. The DNA may be damaged. The original habitat may be gone. And sometimes, the animal's closest living relative isn't even genetically close enough. So which extinct animals actually have a realistic chance of returning? Today, we're counting down 5 extinct animals that scientists could potentially bring back, at least in some form. And number 1 might be the most famous extinct animal on Earth. Number 5, the thylacine. Imagine a dog-sized predator with the body of a wolf, the stripes of a tiger, and a jaw capable of opening surprisingly wide. This was the thylacine, often called the Tasmanian tiger. Despite its nickname, it wasn't actually a tiger. It was a marsupial predator native to Australia and Tasmania. The last known thylacine died in captivity in 1936. For decades, the species was considered completely lost. But unlike animals that disappeared millions of years ago, the thylacine vanished relatively recently. And that's extremely important. Scientists don't need to reconstruct its genome entirely from fossils. Genetic material from preserved specimens still exists. Researchers have been able to sequence large portions of the thylacine genome and compare it with DNA from its living relatives. One of the most important relatives is the fat-tailed dunnart, a tiny marsupial that shares evolutionary similarities with the thylacine. The basic idea would be extraordinary. Scientists could identify genetic differences between the living marsupial and the extinct thylacine, then use gene editing technology to modify cells toward a thylacine-like genetic profile. Those cells could potentially be used to create an embryo. But there's a massive problem. A genetically engineered animal wouldn't necessarily be an exact thylacine. It could be a thylacine-like animal containing many of the extinct species' characteristics. And even if scientists successfully created one, raising it would be another challenge entirely. The animal would need the right environment, behavior, diet, and social learning. So the question isn't simply, can we make one? It's, can we make one that is truly a thylacine? And scientists are getting closer to answering that question. Number 4, the woolly mammoth. Few extinct animals are as iconic as the woolly mammoth. These enormous Ice Age elephants wandered across the frozen landscapes of Europe, Asia, and North America. They had thick fur, layers of body fat, small ears, and enormous curved tusks. And unlike the dinosaurs, mammoths disappeared relatively recently. Some populations survived until only a few thousand years ago. That means scientists have something incredibly valuable: ancient DNA. Mammoth remains have been discovered preserved in permafrost, sometimes with astonishing amounts of biological material still intact. Scientists have sequenced mammoth genomes and identified genes associated with characteristics such as thick hair, fat storage, and cold adaptation. But here's where things get interesting. Scientists don't necessarily need to create a perfect mammoth from scratch. Instead, one proposed strategy is to genetically modify an Asian elephant, the mammoth's closest living relative, to produce some mammoth-like traits. Imagine an elephant with thick, insulating hair, increased body fat, smaller ears, and other adaptations that helped mammoths survive extreme cold. The resulting animal wouldn't technically be a genetically perfect mammoth. It would be something closer to a mammoth-elephant hybrid or mammoth-like elephant. And there's a reason scientists are interested in this. Some researchers believe large, cold-adapted herbivores could potentially influence Arctic ecosystems. But critics point out that the modern Arctic isn't the same environment mammoths once lived in. And there is another ethical question. Should we spend enormous amounts of money bringing back an Ice Age animal when many living species are currently disappearing? That's a debate scientists, conservationists, and governments will have to confront if de-extinction becomes possible. Number 3. The passenger pigeon. This next animal might sound less impressive. It wasn't enormous, it didn't have giant teeth, and it certainly wasn't a prehistoric monster. But its extinction is one of the most dramatic examples of human-caused population collapse. The passenger pigeon once filled the skies of North America. Historical accounts describe flocks so enormous that they could darken the sky for hours. Some estimates suggest billions of passenger pigeons existed in the 19th century. Then, humans began hunting them on an industrial scale. Their enormous colonies also made them easy targets. Within a few decades, their population collapsed. The last known passenger pigeon, named Martha, died in captivity in 1914. But scientists have something extremely valuable: preserved passenger pigeon specimens. Researchers have extracted DNA from museum specimens and used it to study the species' genome. And because passenger pigeons have living relatives, scientists could theoretically use those relatives as a biological starting point. One possible strategy would involve editing the genome of a closely related pigeon to introduce passenger pigeon genetic traits. Then, over multiple generations, scientists could potentially move the population genetically closer to the extinct species. But there's a major obstacle. Passenger pigeons weren't just genetically unique. They were behaviorally unique. They lived in enormous colonies. They migrated together. They reproduced in huge social groups. So creating one bird wouldn't bring back the passenger pigeon. Scientists would need an entire population. And that makes the passenger pigeon an excellent example of the biggest problem with de-extinction. Bringing back an animal isn't the same as bringing back a species. Number 2. The quagga. Now let's talk about an extinct animal that looks almost too strange to be real. The quagga was a subspecies of plains zebra that once lived in southern Africa. At first glance, it looked like a normal zebra, but its body had a bizarre pattern. Its front half was covered in stripes, its rear half was mostly brown, and its stripes became weaker as they moved toward the back of the body. The quagga was hunted heavily during the 19th century. The last known quagga died in captivity in 1883. But there's an unusual twist to this story. Scientists discovered that quaggas weren't a completely separate species from living plains zebras. They were closely related. In fact, genetic research showed that quaggas were a population of plains zebras with distinctive genetic characteristics. That created a fascinating possibility. Instead of recreating the quagga from scratch, scientists could selectively breed plains zebras to produce animals with increasingly quagga-like characteristics. And this is actually being attempted. The quagga project has been breeding zebras with the goal of recreating the quagga's appearance. The result isn't genetically identical to the original quagga, but some modern zebras now display remarkably quagga-like patterns. This raises a fascinating question. If an animal looks and behaves like an extinct species, but doesn't have exactly the same genome, have we really brought the species back? Scientists don't have a universally accepted answer, but the quagga demonstrates something important. Sometimes, de-extinction doesn't require futuristic cloning technology. Sometimes, selective breeding can take us surprisingly far. Number 1. The dodo. And finally, the animal almost everyone thinks of when they hear the word extinct. The dodo. This strange flightless bird lived on Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. It had no natural fear of humans, and that turned out to be disastrous. After humans arrived on Mauritius, hunting, habitat destruction, and introduced animals such as rats, pigs, and other predators contributed to the dodo's disappearance. The last confirmed sightings occurred in the late 17th century. For centuries, the dodo existed only in drawings, bones, and museum specimens. But scientists have been able to recover and study dodo DNA, and modern genetic technology has opened an intriguing possibility. The dodo's closest living relatives include pigeons and other birds in the pigeon family. Researchers could potentially compare the dodo genome with genomes from living relatives and identify the genetic differences that made the dodo unique. Then, in theory, gene editing technology could be used to modify cells from a living relative. But birds create an additional challenge. Their reproductive biology makes techniques like traditional mammalian cloning much more complicated. Scientists would need a way to turn genetically modified cells into viable reproductive cells and eventually produce an embryo. And even if that became possible, there would still be another problem. What exactly would scientists create? A perfect genetic copy of the original dodo? Or a bird that looks and behaves like a dodo, but contains some DNA from a living relative? For now, the technology isn't there to simply manufacture a perfect dodo. But among recently extinct animals, the dodo remains one of the species that researchers consider scientifically interesting for de-extinction research. But there's something we haven't talked about. Even if scientists succeed, where would these animals go? The world they once inhabited has changed. Forests have disappeared, predators have changed, climate conditions are different, and humans now occupy environments that were once completely wild. A resurrected animal could be genetically impressive, but ecologically helpless. That's why many scientists argue that the ultimate goal shouldn't simply be bring extinct animals back. Instead, it should be protect the animals we still have, because preventing extinction is usually far easier than reversing it. The thylacine, the woolly mammoth, the passenger pigeon, the quagga, and the dodo. 5 extinct animals that might someday exist again, although perhaps not exactly as they once did. And that leaves us with one final question. If scientists could bring back just one extinct animal, which one should they choose? The terrifying thylacine, the enormous mammoth, or the bizarre dodo? Because the next chapter of Earth's history may not be about discovering extinct animals. It may be about deciding which ones deserve a second chance.